Welcome to Chapter 5 of the First Hebrew Primer. Let's take a look at the vocabulary. The good news is there's a lot of repetition with the vocabulary this week, so most of these words you've already had. Yada in the upper right hand there is to know in the cow stem, to cause to know in the hifil stem. We looked at yalad, which means to give birth or beget in the cow stem, or the pa'al stem, it means to cause to have a child in the hifil stem. Yatsa means to go forth, go out in the cow stem. It means to cause to go out or bring out in the hifil. Yarad means to go down or descend in the cow stem, and it means to cause to go down or lower in the hifil stem. In the upper left, we have the verb nafal, which means to fall in the kal or pa'al stem. In the hifil stem, it means to cause to fall or to knock down. This next verb, very common in the Psalms, natsal, means to save, rescue, snatch away in the hifil. Then there's the noun chutz, which means outside. Then we have the word for scroll, sefer. And then finally the verb nagad, to tell or declare. Now we're actually not going to cover a new verbal pattern in this lecture. Instead, we're going to look at really how to identify the roots and some issues with some weak verbs. So there are what are called transformer verbs, and that's first yod verbs, particularly in the hifil stem. So yods whose root begins with a yod in the hifil stem have a really striking irregularity, and that is many of them that initial yod will change to a holom vav. And that makes the word look very irregular. So you still have the hey prefix that we're used to seeing, but that initial yod of the consonant will transform into a holom vav. The reason for this has to do with the history of the Hebrew language. A lot of the first yod root verbs were originally in pre-biblical Hebrew first vav roots, and so when you put a prefix on it, it kind of reverts back to that original vav. You don't have to know any of that, but that's one of the reasons why the language seems kind of weird here. So when you see a root like this, like yoshiv, you just have to realize that, well, you're like, what's that? I know the hey prefix is probably a hifil. What's that yod doing there? Or that vav doing there? And that's a marker of a first yod verb. It will still have the endings of the perfect. It still has the hey prefix to recognize it as a hifil. That's just one of the oddities there. And you can see that in the imperfect. Again, the yod changes to a holom. In the imperative, the infinitive construct, regular infinitive, in the emphatic infinitive, and in the participle. There are also verbal roots that are called drop letter roots. For example, first noon. In the hifil stem, the initial noon of the root will drop out in every form of every conjugation. So as you look at the perfect here, this is from the verb natsal, to deliver. We just looked at that in the vocabulary. But you can see when you add that hey prefix of the imperfect, that original noon drops out and you get a dagesh forte in the next root consonant. Good way to think about this is kind of like the noon has balled up and is hiding itself as that doubling dot in the tzadeh, which is essentially what's happening there. And the tricky part about this is trying to figure out what the root is, because the vocabulary that you memorize, of course, is tied to the root. The way you look it up in a lexicon is by the root. And so you're down to 2 root consonants left. So it's being able to recognize, okay, there's only 2 root consonants left. I see a dagesh forte in that first one. That could be a first noon. The root might be natsal. So it's a little bit more of like detective work or solving a puzzle to get back to what that original root is. And that's kind of what we want to look at. How to identify verbal roots. And this is really important for a couple of reasons, to be able to get back, to strip a verb back to its triconsonantal root. One is that's the form you memorize the words in. So it's tied to your vocabulary. But secondly, even if you don't know the vocabulary word, the words verbal roots are organized by root in the lexicon. So if you want to look it up in a lexicon, you have to know what the triconsonantal root is to be able to look it up. And so it is really important to be able to have that skill of figuring out what verbal root any particular verb is from. So the first thing you want to do to identify a verbal root, step 1, remove any prepositions, vav conjunctions, or any heys connected to the beginning of a word. So let's look at this first word. We have v'shamar. To get back to the root, you want to remove that vav, and it's shin mem resh. Or if you look at this infinitive l'daber, you want to remove the lamed, and then you've got dalet beit resh, and that's your verbal root. So that's step 1. Remove any prepositions, vavs, or heys at the beginning of the word. Step 2 then is remove any signal letters at the beginning, middle, or end of the word. So let's look at this first example. We have eshmor. That's in the imperfect conjugation. The aleph is a signal letter. That's not part of the root. So we want to remove that. If we're going to try to, get back to the root so we can look it up in the lexicon, and we're left with shin mem resh, which is the root. Or here we have hashomer. It's a participle form with a definite article on the front. So we want to take the hey off, right? We take the hey off. And then step 2, we remove the signal letter. So this holem vav is a signal letter that's part of the participle form. And we're left with shin mem resh. Or here's another participle down here. Dabarim. We want to remove the vav, conjunction, the mem, signal letter, right? That's a prefix of the participle. And the yod mem at the end is the masculine plural indicator. So we want to take all those off, and we're back to dalet beit resh, which is our triconsonantal root. Or here's another reversing vav, perfect, the vahil bishu. So you want to remove the vav, remove the hey, because that is a part of the hifil stem. So we want to remove the hey, remove that middle yod, that's part of the hifil stem as well. And then the final shurik is a signal letter too. So we just remove all of those. We're left with lamed beit shin. And so if we're, again, looking it up in the lexicon, that's what we'd look it up under. So that's step 2. Step 3 is remove any possessive pronoun endings. Remember, verbs can take possessive pronouns. So you want to remove those. They're not part of the verbal root. So here we have lishmorcha. We want to remove the lamed. That's a preposition, of course. And then the ka at the end is that 2ms pronoun suffix. And then we're left with shamar, shin mem resh. Or here's another example. We have be'emor chem. You want to remove the beit. That's a preposition. Remove the chem. That's a 2mp ending, pronoun ending, and we're left with amar. Or uv omdo. Again, remove the shurik. That's the vav conjunction. Remove the beit preposition. Remove the 3ms pronoun suffix, and we're left with ayin mem dalet. Again, that's the form you can go and look up in a lexicon or a dictionary. Now, here's another question. What happens if you do all that? You're removing everything that has to be removed. The signal letters, the pronoun endings, and you only have 2 root consonants left. What's up with that? Well, if that's the case, and this happens quite often in Hebrew, you either have a drop letter verb, like it could be a first noon or first lamed. You have a hollow verb, right? A middle vav or yod. Or it could be a third hey verb. Or it could be completely irregular. So it's helpful to know what the options are. If you're missing a letter, it's either a drop letter verb, a hollow verb, it ends in a third hey verb, or it's a completely irregular verb. So let's just go through this process a little bit. Look at this verb, emda. You're like, okay, I know the aleph is probably a signal letter of the imperfect, right? First common singular imperfect. So we take off the aleph. Now we're left with this just dalet ayin. You think, okay, maybe it's a drop letter verb. Maybe it's a first noon. And so you look up noon dalet ayin, and you discover in a lexicon that doesn't exist. Okay, it's not that. Or maybe it's a meaning that makes no sense in the context. You're like, okay, that's probably not it. Then you look up, okay, what's the another option? Maybe it's a first yod verb. So then it's yod dalet ayin. Oh, yeah, that's to know. And the really common verbs like yada, you're going to become pretty familiar with, so that even when you only see 2 signal letters left, your mind should go there pretty quickly. Like, oh yeah, that's from yada. Let's look at another example here. This is higadti. And as you look at that form, you go, okay, the hey heroic prefix, that's probably a hifil perfect. So we take the hey off. The T ending is one of the endings of the perfect. It's one of those atata T utemtenu endings. We'll take that off. Now we're left with just gimel dalet. Like, okay, what could that be? Well, there is that dot in the gimel, that dagesh forte. That tells you it's probably a first noon. But maybe you don't notice that right away, and you look up, well, maybe it's a first yod, right? The last one was a first yod. Let's look up a yod. Yod gimel dalet. Like, okay, that's not really a verb. So you X that out. That doesn't exist. It's probably noon gimel dalet. Maybe that's what it is. And of course, that's what it is in this case. So again, if you're missing a letter, it's going to be either drop letter, hollow verb, a third hey verb, or a completely irregular verb. If it's not, so the previous example were 2 drop letter verbs. It was a first yod, first noon. First lamed is often like that as well. If it's not a drop letter verb, it might be a hollow verb. So if you're still kind of running into trouble, try adding a yod or a vav between the 2 root letters that are left. So like here we have the verb kamti. You're like, okay, the T ending is the endings of the perfect, right? The atatati utemtenu endings. We let's take that off. We're left with kof mem. Like, okay, it's not noon kof mem. It's not yod kof mem. Those don't make any sense, or they don't exist. What if it's a kof vav mem? Oh, that's a verb we know. And again, this is a really common verb. I just start getting used to seeing it without the vav in the middle to be able to recognize it as to arise or to get up. Here's another example, vasamnu. Like, okay, the vav conjunction, we strip that off. The new ending is one of the endings of the perfect, right? The atata ti utemtenu, it's the new ending, so we drop that off. We're left with sam. Like, okay, what is that? Well, it's not yasam. Oh, maybe it's first noon. Oh, it's not from nasam. Let's try to put a vav or a yod in there from seem. Oh yeah, seem. Maybe you even remember that word from your vocab. Okay, if it's not a drop letter verb, yod or noon, or it's not a hollow verb, it might be a verb that ends in a hey. So you can try adding the hey in as a root letter to look it up in a dictionary. So here we have va'asu. Can we drop the vav off? We drop the u signal letter off. We're left with ayin seen. Now again, you probably know your vocab well enough to be able to recognize what this is, even at this point. But let's say you didn't. You're like, maybe it's a drop letter. Look up yod ayin seen. Okay, that's not it. Maybe it's a hollow root. You look up ayin vav seen or ayin yod seen. Okay, that's not it. Think of third hey. Ayin seen hey, to do or make. Here's another verb, vayar. Like, okay, we take the vav conjunction off, we take the yod signal letter off, we're left with resh aleph. Again, you probably know your vocabulary well enough to know, oh, I see what that is, right? You recognize what that is right away. But, again, let's say you didn't. You think maybe it's noon resh ayin or yod resh ayin. Now, yod resh ayin is a pretty common verb as well. It means to be afraid or to fear. So you might have to look in the context to see if that makes sense. But it's certainly not noon resh aleph. It's not resh vav aleph. It's not a hollow root. Oh, maybe it's third hey. So resh aleph hey. Now, those suggestions that I just made and that the textbook made there, they don't work with irregular verbs. Irregular are called irregular because they're irregular. So there are some irregular verbs that are used all the time. And really the only strategy is to familiarize yourself with those conjugations. So like natan, I'd spend some time in your textbook. There's a whole paradigm of natan. Spend some time checking that out. Halak, lakach. Take a look at that in the pa'al pattern, and that's going to really help you out a lot, especially with those common verbs. And then fifth, remember that the hifil transformer verbs have a vav instead of a yod as the first root letter. So to find those roots, you have to replace the yod with a vav. So hopefully that helps you out as you try to seek to be able to identify these verbs. It takes lots of practice. So be patient with yourself You're going to be able to get this, but it will just take some time.